G'day IB Psychologists. The new IB Psychology Guide is published. There's a lot going on, so I'm going to see if I can explain it as simply as I can in about 6 or 7 minutes. Let's start with the 4 contexts. These are health and well-being, human relationships, human development, and learning and cognition. These take 100 hours to teach, and so there's a lot of content here. Right? So I would begin understanding the guide with figuring out with each of these contexts what it is you need to teach. Now for each context, there's specific content that you have to teach. Roughly, there's about 8 to 10 content points per context. And the content is the approaches, right? Biological approach, cognitive approach, and socio-cultural approach. So most of the content that falls for each context is relevant to those approaches. Now, there are some exceptions, all right? So if you look at the biological approach topics, for example, there's about 5 or 6 topics there that don't mesh or don't fit in with any of these contexts, like biological reductionism, animal models, to name a couple. Now, stick around at the end. I'll tell you what I've done with them, and you can do the same. But just what I would suggest, instead of trying to teach or plan out your course with the 3 approaches and then the context, just combine them. If you think back to the old curriculum, if you're familiar with it, we had the approaches first and then the options. This new guide has really just combined that because a lot of us were teaching that way anyway. So 4 contexts, and each of those contexts has content from the approaches. So far, the new guide is quite similar to the old one, right? We've got the 4 contexts, which we used to call the options, and embedded in there are the 3 approaches. Something new, and I think kind of interesting, are the class practicals. So with each context, there's a specific class practical that has to be taught. So there's questionnaires in human relationships, observations in human development, interviews in health and wellness, and experiments in learning and cognition. All right, I hope you're with me so far, because here's where it gets a little squirrely, and this is going to be the biggest curveball, I think, with this new guide, is in the concepts. So underlying all of this content for the approaches and the context are these 6 concepts: bias, perspective, responsibility, change, measurement, and causality. Now let's talk about assessments. Personally, I think assessment should drive teaching, and if it's not, you need to change your assessments. That's just my personal belief, right? You've got to teach to the test, because what's the point in teaching something if you're not going to see if you taught it? So looking at the assessments, the paper 1 part A and paper 1 part B are based on the approaches: biological, cognitive, socio-cultural. Only the content that appears under those headings in the guide. Now rest assured, in future videos I'll take each of these questions and make tutorials on how I would approach answering them and my advice for teachers and students, but I want to give a quick introduction here. The practicals are assessed in paper 2 part A. There are 4 pretty static questions where students will explain and write about what they did in their practicals. So those questions are pretty straightforward, right? Paper 1, section A, straightforward short answer question, much like the old ones with a little difference. Paper 1, section B, again, you take the knowledge from the approaches and they apply it to some new problem. It's pretty straightforward content. Paper 2, section A, 4 static question based on the class practical, quite easy to prepare for. Here's where it gets tricky. This is going to be really challenging. In future videos, I'm going to explain my approach and how I would teach this and how I go about teaching it. But paper 1, section C is a 15-mark essay in which one of these 6 concepts will be linked to one of the 4 contexts. Now, the idea here is to get away from memorization and for students to be able to take what they've learned and apply it to a new question, and so they can take this conceptual understanding they've built, this knowledge of this stuff, and apply it to a new question. All right, so that's paper 1, section C, links the concepts to the contexts. Now, my opinion, I think this course is now really heavy on research methods. All right, so yes, if you looked in paper 1A's, the short answer questions, they've got away from having to use studies, but the focus is really on research methods. And just have a look at the guide. When you look at the concepts here, you'll see most of the bullet points and most of the content there is really relevant to research methods. How do we know what we know in psychology? Of course, the class practicals are all about research methods as well. And paper 2, section B is also an unseen study, and it asks students about their knowledge of research methods in relation to the concepts. Okay, looking ahead to planning your course, if you're a teacher, my advice, begin chunking. Break this down into manageable chunks. And this has already been done for us in the new guide. For example, in human relationships, it's broken down into interpersonal relationships and group behavior. In health and wellness, mental disorders, and health problems, I believe, are the subheadings. Learning and cognition has 2 different groups. So you can start breaking it down into individual units. Now, for me personally, I'm quite excited because I don't really like teaching and getting up and saying, right, next week we start group behavior or we start interpersonal relationships. To cover group behavior, I've got a unit on cults. To cover a lot of the biological approach and interpersonal relationships with aggression, criminology. With interpersonal relationships and the role of communication and how to improve relationships, we've got couples. Learning and cognition, memory, manipulation, personality, and morality in human development. So I can get up at the start of my course and say, right, next week we start cults, and then criminology and couples. After that, we'll get into manipulation and memory. So that would be how I would go about planning the course. Just think about manageable chunks, take what you already teach, and see where it's going to fit in with the new guide. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was the internal assessment. This now is not actually a conducted experiment. Students come up with a research proposal, and then this gives them the freedom to choose a different research method if they want. Observation, interview, questionnaire, something that they might not have done in the old IA. Now, I haven't covered what the higher level course requires. Essentially, it's everything in the standard level course. And then in addition, there are 3 extension topics with a lot of data analysis and interpretation, but I'll make videos on that shortly.